Good morning and welcome to another edition of Backstage Pass. My guest today is Mark White, the ETC Regional Manager for the UK and Ireland. Mark, good morning and welcome to Backstage
Good morning,
Pass.
Bill, and thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So Mark, when we were talking the other day, last night, you had mentioned that you came late to the industry. You were in your early 30s, I think you said.
That's right.
And so I am curious because I started a lot earlier than that, for better or for worse. And I was wondering what brought that on?
Probably all stems back to when I was probably 9. I was taken to a production of Oliver. Mm-hmm. And I saw on this stage a revolve which had a house that turned around. The music was fantastic, it was sung well, and I'm sitting there looking at these things like these lights and this thing turning around, thinking, that's what I really want to do. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to be on the stage or just making it all happen from behind. Right. But that's where it all stems from, and thank you to my mother for taking us to that performance.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Right. But you were doing, when we talked last night, you were doing other stuff in between that show and when you got heavily into the industry.
Yeah, I guess I did well enough at the equivalent of high school to be able to go off to university and to go and do medical things. But I spent too much time in the theatre, I think is the best description.
Yeah, right.
Like most of us, and that is that you get to play in a theatre which you could go and play with because no one else really told you. You had
Sure.
a technician that made sure you didn't electrocute yourself,
right.
Or fall off a ladder, but apart from that it was basically you go make what you can of this.
Right.
So I did.
Good.
So that was
So when you did get started, what kind of stuff did you first get into?
I've always been fascinated by light and the fact that you could change colour from a light. That to me was wonderful, and I spent a lot of time as a kid getting various sorts of coloured medium like cellophane wrapping and stuff and sticking in front of an ordinary light bulb and trying to work out how it is that you can make that light go in a given direction and a different colour. So the usual thing about putting light bulbs in cans and things and trying to make them work properly.
Right.
And the magical thing of dimming. That was how to make things appear out of darkness. And that was the fascination for me.
Mm-hmm. Making magic.
Yeah, exactly. It is making magic.
Right. Sure.
And you learn at an early age that the whole object is that you direct the audience's attention to where you want it to be.
Terrific.
Yeah, that was and so the other part was more of a sort of almost a serendipity. And that was, did well enough to get me into a place which I probably really wasn't suited for.
Well, I think that's probably true for a lot of us. We
Sure.
kind of fake our way in and go from there.
Yeah, Ken Bennett Hunter, who just died, and he had done he was a producer, he was all sorts of things. He was a journalist and a lovely man. And he thought that about a third of people end up in theatre that have done something else before. Right. Which is both, as I guess we'll talk about, both good and bad.
Right. I just a quick story about when I saw my first Vera light, my first moving light, which was in '82 here in the city with Genesis and Three Sides Live, because they were the ones who bought into and helped develop, provide the money to develop it. And it was just one of those experiences that completely blew me away, obviously, right? And I asked people, and I'm wondering where you were, what you were doing when you first saw a Vera light.
Vera light. The first thing I was, at that point, I was the chief electrician of Cats in London, which didn't have any moving lights on it whatsoever. because it was a 1981 rig. And in 1985 or 86, there was a production of Time, which was it starred Cliff Richard, and it was Dave Clark, who was in the Dave Clark 5, and he put this spectacular on up at the Dominion Theatre, the like of which we had never seen and will never see again. At one point, overnight, there were 42 electricians wiring up the set and all the bits that go. Well, this thing was crazy. However, what it did have was 24 VL2s on it. And I hadn't really seen anything until I had seen these things there. And on top of that, the Verilight technicians would all come to the pub, and they would talk about the things they were allowed to talk about what's inside and how it could make 96 colours and all those sort of things. And this to us was, of course, the future.
Right. Yeah, I remember that when we saw them, they were the VL1s,
Right.
and there was no pub discussion. You know, there was the cloak of secrecy was just wrapped around
Sure.
those things completely. Come in the middle of the night, you know, no discussion whatsoever, no peeking in the crates or anything.
No, there wasn't. And I first saw a VL1 when we had it at a Showlight conference in Glasgow, I think it was, and they bought one out, one of the only ones remaining that works.
Right.
And they fired it up. And this thing was, I could understand exactly why everyone thought this was the Bears' pajamas. I had a bit of a baptism of fire, really, in terms of working in the West End. Arrived off a plane.
Okay.
And decided that I needed to work in theatre. So I got a job as a stagehand, being a flyman on the Ambassadors Theatre, the smallest theatre in London. And it was a 2-week job on the Art of Noise, was a pop group that was around at the time, also a big record producing company. And basically we used to haul stuff around and get down the stage and do stuff during the scene changes. And that job was for 2 weeks. And suddenly I discovered that the things I'd been doing in amateur theatre, which was hauling lines around and doing it on 4 people on a rope and tying things off and getting them weighted up, was exactly the same as in the amateur theatre, except there was no alcohol in the theatre, that one. Whereas at 14 years old, some of the amateur flymen taught me how to drink beer by being up in the flyers.
Excellent.
That was part of the job.
Excellent. So after your flyman job, where did you?
I answered an ad in the stage newspaper for a chief electrician at the Richmond Theatre. Richmond's in Surrey, so just outside of London. And it was a touring house, and it had a new show every week. And so you had the fit up on the Monday morning. You then got your lights rigged, which the company manager may or may not know about. They just hand you a lighting plan and say, do this. You try and get that rigged, set on stage, and then you start plotting in the afternoon on a manual 60-way board through presets. And you're having to write everything down, every cue and all the rest of it. And some of the stuff was really simple, sort of lights up, lights down and a few specials, but some of it was extremely complex. And the more complex the show was, the closer you got to curtain up. So you're effectively going up blind on a show you'd never seen and just try to follow what's coming over the cans and what's written in front of you.
Right.
That was interesting.
Did you get any training? I mean, I remember when I first did a little bit of lighting and was trying to deal with lighting boards of the day, and I had no clue and nobody was showing me. Was it similar for you? I mean,
yeah, it was the same. And basically, they had the deputy electrician who had been there for quite some time and wanted my job, wanted to be the chief electrician, but wasn't promoted. So he very reluctantly showed me how to work this thing.
Right.
Sort of knew anyway, but it was
Right.
it didn't take long.
Where my interest here is, I mean, you've done a lot of work on the West End.
Yep.
Which I have not had much of an opportunity to do, and I'd like to to see what the similarities and the dissimilarities are from working here and working.
I've only done one show in Broadway, which was Aspects of Love. And I was working for Howard Eaton at the time, and he came over with the new Strand Powells, they were called, which is a programmable automated lighting system. And it was Andrew Lloyd Webber's, one of his attempts to get into Broadway, and that show is remembered solely from today as the show that lost the most amount of money ever on $6.5 million. And this was in something like 1989 or thereabouts, maybe 1990. And it was, and the Powells didn't work. I'm sure my friends at Strand won't have me worried. I won't be too worried when I say that Powells actually stood for Purchase Another Lighting System. And it just didn't work, and we were here because of, they didn't work.
Right.
And then the show didn't, so it really wasn't a problem.
Wasn't a problem. They didn't.
No.
Eventually, they didn't try and resolve the issue. They just closed.
It didn't
the
have
show.
to. The show closed, so that was
closed.
the
Problem resolved for you.
Exactly.
Right. Terrific. Aspects of Love closed, and that was your one experience here.
That's right.
But you've worked a lot on the West End.
Yeah, absolutely.
theaters.
The difference between here and there was that the union rules for working are a whole lot different.
Sure.
And that whole business about if I started at 9 o'clock in the morning doing something or other, I had to be out of that building at 5 to 12 and not come back in before 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and then have to go home at 6 o'clock at night, whatever it was. That's the sort of stuff which I was suddenly discovered that it was a really, really good idea to get out of the building and to be seen to be out of the building at 5 to 12, so you don't have to pay overtime for everybody else that's in the building at the time. It's those sort of rules that we didn't have, and that was interesting.
Right.
The other thing also about Broadway theatres is that there's a four walls deal here, and that is the entire backstage is stripped out, and the production company coming in brings in everything.
Right.
The flying, the rigging, the lights, all that bit, the power supplies and stuff. Whereas in the West End, all that's there. Yeah. That is all, it's a part of every theatre, all that infrastructure.
So the theaters own their own lighting systems.
They own all the infrastructure, so they own all of the wiring and all of and generally, the distribution stuff.
Sure.
Certainly own all the dimmers.
Right.
They are always in the dimmer room, and you've got the socket outlets around the place.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And that's the difference.
Okay.
So yeah.
That and the fact that they paint the word asbestos across the iron, the fire safety curtain on occasion.
Here, the word asbestos?
Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
And that gets into part of the thing of the terminology around the world.
Sure.
And how certain words mean, well, almost opposite things in bits of the world.
Right.
Which has been fascinating to work with.
A fire safety curtain over there is an iron.
Yeah, because it's clad with iron on both sides.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Which I don't think we ever did here, and we certainly don't do that now.
Right.
Yeah. It's never had an iron. It's just we've had asbestos for
exactly.
a long time.
Well, when I was working on Miss Saigon at Drury Lane, Theatre Royal Drury Lane, apparently the second most famous theatre in the world, is that it had an asbestos curtain on the back of it,
right?
But an iron one on the front, on the audience side. And this was removed because we had a limit switch that was running up and down the asbestos. It was to do with some trucks at Miss Saigon which were coming down underneath the iron. And basically, if the iron started to come in, you needed to make sure these trucks ran upstage very quickly to get the iron in to do the fire barrier part. After a while, it was noted that the limit switch, which is a big rubber wheel, was actually starting to wear a little track in the asbestos. Which point in time, it was all replaced with metal.
Right. So you said it's the second most famous theatre in the world.
This is an old story of mine, and that is that I used to say when I was working at the Royal Opera House, I worked at the Royal Opera House Covent Garden, was the most famous building or famous theatre in the world, which of course provoked outrage from all sorts of other people.
I would think, yeah.
So, and I remember Alan Lampert Grayo really having a right go at me because she said, how dare I compare that tiny little opera house in Covent Garden with Radio City Music Hall. And of course, then the others in San Francisco said the San Francisco Memorial Opera or the Sydney Opera House or somewhere else. So it's now, I always say, it's the second most famous theatre. And the answer is, what's the most famous theatre? Whatever you think it is.
So you've worked at the second most famous theatre in the world, the Royal Opera House.
I've worked at a few second most famous theatres in the world.
But this particular one, you've done a lot of work there. What was it like?
Fascinating place, and it was a true opera factory. It was probably the most busy stage in the world in the sense that it worked 7 days a week. And it was doing the morning rehearsal, which you cleared off, and set and everything disappeared off. Then you put up the evening show. Then the night gang came in overnight, took down that one, put up the morning rehearsal, and so this continued. And on Sundays, when there were no performances, it was given over totally to rehearsal for some show that's coming up, where they did a top and tail rehearsals and lighting states and the rest of it.
When they built that theater, was that the plan? Or did it require you to fuss with this building a lot?
In terms of when it was built in 1858?
Right.
No. Up until about the late 50s, it had stagioni, it had seasons. So, for example, they were doing Christmas pantomime, peculiarly English invention of how to entertain families at Christmas time. And they did that. And it really wasn't until about 100 years after it was built, that they started to do opera and ballet full time there. And that's when it became the famous bit.
Right.
And so they basically ran that house to its absolute maximum capacity.
Right.
And that was that's how we did it.
Right. Did they do it with a house staff and what I would call overhire, or is it everybody do they work there full time? I would think that there would be a little difficulty getting people who didn't know the building to fit in.
Yeah, no, when I got there was a most peculiar system that had gone on forever. Basically, because it was a part-time thing of having staff only there sometimes, they used all the porters, people who carried stuff around at Covent Garden, and they would come in during the night or whatever time and actually do this work. Then they'd go off again and be porters in Covent Garden.
Oh.
Now, that led to a few things. First was that there was an almost mafia arrangement where the families from Holborn in London that ran Covent Garden Market also ran Covent Garden in the Opera House. And when I got there in '92, there were 3 families. And of the 720 people at the Royal Opera House, which included the orchestra and the ballet and all those other folk, there was something like 390 people who had some sort of connection with one of these 3 families. And they're everywhere. The cleaners, the working on the stage and the rest of it. So yes, it was great.
Right. A family business.
It was a genuine family business. And and they would, there was the recruitment policy was almost left to them.
Right.
Anyway, what it ended up with was you have all of these people who were full-time and permanent, and it was a huge demarcation. So when I would walk on stage to get a show ready at 8 o'clock in the morning, to get a show ready for the 10:30 rehearsal that day, getting the set on the stage and getting the lights set, the rest of it, you'd have anything up to 72 people doing stuff, getting it there. But the demarcation was they had an imaginary centre line down the stage, and you had those on stage right, which was known as OP, opposite prompt, those on stage left. And there were 12 men, as they were then, and they basically didn't cross this centre line. Really? So the third show that I did was was Mitridate, which is early Mozart opera, and it required 14 people on prompt side and 10 people on OP. This meant, because no one crossed over, that you hired 2 extra people on prompt side while 2 people sat idle. on the other side, and that was that to me was an eye opener. But then I also ran A and B shifts, so you would have in the morning would be A shift for sort of 3 mornings a week, and then that would swap to B shift, and vice versa. They would swap to the afternoon. So my job as a technical manager was in essence to inform, to watch all rehearsals and everything else, but then to inform the next shift of any changes that had happened since they'd last seen the show.
Right.
So incredibly cumbersome sort of a place. And then you had the fly floor. Then there was the electricians, and then the prop makers. And there were 3 prop makers, or 3 props people.
Right.
And part of my job of getting the show on the stage or even off the stage in the afternoon was that there were rules about, let alone not working on one side or the other, but if there was a piece of scenery, was it a prop or was it a piece of stage scenery?
Right.
And it meant that only the scenic guys could handle the scenery and only the props guys could handle the props. That was it.
Right.
Yep. When you got to something which was like, it's a crossover between the pair of them, one of which was a table which was already set with the cutlery and the dishes and the plastic fruit and all that bit.
Right.
And they'd made it in the prop shop. And it was sitting on a piece of ply. It was about 4 by 6 feet roughly, funny shape for perspective. And they then, there's an argument which ensues about this is so big it must require 4 people to do it. And then the props guys are saying, no, actually we could do it with 2 of us, but it really only needs 2 of us, not 3. And so this argument would ensue and all work would stop. And part of my job as a technical manager was in essence, at that point in time, to take the combatants down to the pub where there would be a ritual pint of beer which would be bought by either me as management or these guys, depending on whose turn it was to buy the beer since the last dispute.
Right.
And you would then have this argument which would go on for a while, and then you'd come back agreeing something or other for this particular show.
Sounds awfully civilized.
Well, the Brits are rather civilised. There wasn't a lot of shouting involved.
Right.
There was a bit of name calling, but that was that was fine, and a bit of sort of harumphing about the place. But no, we don't do shouting.
No. Okay. So we were talking about your working at the Opera House at Covent Garden.
Yeah.
How did you get that job?
Well, I was very lucky. I tell the story that I was kicking a can up Bow Street. And I saw this place, that'd be a nice place to work. I'll see what I can do to go there. It wasn't quite like that. John Hastie, this is pre-Stage Technologies days, in fact pre-Automation House days. We were building automation systems in the basements of the theatres, so the stuff that we were doing. And a show that you would assemble a whole load of kit and then you hope to hell it worked when you turned it on and all the other bits that go with that automation systems. So,
so the automation business hasn't really changed any, is what you're saying.
Oh, I suspect it might have changed a bit since then. But yes, in the sense that, we switch it on and hope it works. Yep, that bit's the good bit. Right. So anyway, where John had got the job to wire up a point hoist system, 24 axes of single rope hoists, and which were in huge cabinets. And he said, was I available? Because his good friend Ted Moore, now of course of Tate Stage Technologies, couldn't come because he was wiring up the Beatrix Potter Visitor Centre up in the Lake District, putting up birdies and other things up there. So I go along for what I think is 3 days while Ted can come back. Client changes their mind up at the Beatrix Potter Centre, Ted can't come back, I stay.
Right.
And basically we get it all to work, we make it all happen, and there's this vacancy for a technical manager. And there were 4 technical managers. There were 2 of us who did the engineering parts, and there were 2 guys who did essentially stage management roles. So we tended to do the opera because they were the more complex, suited me because I didn't really like ballet, I loved opera. So occasionally when you had to do opera, it was really sort of dull and boring. You've got to sit there and watch these, dancing around and so forth. However, they said, oh, you look a nice sort of a person, why don't you stay along and become part of the technical management team, which I did.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. I've been, by the way, in the Beatrix Potter information location. I've been there since then. We ended up on a motorcycle ride there.
Ah, right.
And it was lovely.
Did Ted do well?
He did well.
Oh, good,
He
that's
did.
all right.
He did.
Did he mention that he'd actually wired it up when you were there?
I don't know that he actually
Not
admitted
loudly
to it.
or something.
Yeah, I don't think he
okay,
admitted
fine.
to it at that particular point.
Yeah. However.
So after Covent Garden, where did you go?
Well, the Covent Garden changed when I was there. So indeed we were putting shows on the stage and making all the rigging work and getting up in the grid and lumping chain hoists about and that sort of stuff, because that was left to us to do. Mm-hmm. And that was great. Learned a lot about chain hoists and things. And then there'd always been a rebuilding exercise which was going to go on, because the place was technically a mess. It was very difficult. A whole lot of people needed to do stuff. And so two things happened. First was that they changed the working agreement, so that doing away with this demarcation part and basically starting to train people in to do a range of jobs. So you first started off by being, if you were a flyman, then that's what you learned to do. You then got some formal qualifications in it, what we called then NVQs, National Vocational Qualifications. And then you got paid a certain amount of money. Then if you went and did something else, which was to learn to do the electrics or whatever, or vice versa, you got paid even more money. And you could go and do 3 of these courses. So from grade 4, which was actually paid quite well, you could be grade 5 and grade 6, where you could do all these things. And so you formed these technicians into groups of teams. So they still had their specialties, but there were basically 11 people doing this, putting this show on and the rest of it. And they were the lead team for this part. So the fascinating part was that once the staff had got the hang of being retrained into something else, you saw people who'd never been up a ladder in 25 years suddenly getting up and doing stuff because they're going to get paid more money for doing it.
Right.
And so that went away, and that system continues to this day.
Right.
So then, that's bit. Then we get on to the redevelopment, because the place is a mess. The roof leaks, all sorts of things just don't work in the place anymore, and it's being asked to do far too much.
Right.
So there was a complete rebuilding of it. So that happened. They got the money in August of '95, and the house then closed for 2 and a bit years on Bastille Day in 1997. Mm-hmm. So, and then and in the meantime, they'd set up their own theatre consultancy, and I became a theatre consultant for the Royal Opera House.
Right.
And my job was to do the lighting, to do all the lighting schemes and all the rest of it. Then, when the Opera House had never done this before, and they employed a construction company, and the construction company said to the Opera House, you need somebody on site, sitting in the construction company. So I became, and they said, and he's the one to do it.
Right.
So I moved into
You were
construction.
voluntold, is what you were.
Oh, absolutely. You're going to, you're going down there. So I was in the middle of this construction company, what we would call a client representative. I don't know what happens, it's called here. But basically, I'm the vehicle in between the construction company and the Royal Opera House. So in other words, if there are some of the design things you cannot achieve, or you can't do it for the money, or whatever, it goes through this particular part.
So that begs the question, do they use the same negotiating method that they used in the theatre previously, by going to the pub?
Yes and no. What they discovered, and the thing was that we were so used to putting shows on the stage that basically everyone mucks in.
Right.
Everyone actually, helps and gets it going. This will be a production process. Okay, so it'll take, 18, 24 months, and but we're all going to be in this together and we're going to be working on it. Did they hell? We awarded the contract for the electrical contractor. And they signed it, and then we went round the pub, as a result, with everybody. Next morning, the first lawyer's letter arrives from them saying they're going to do stuff or they're not going to do stuff or whatever. And so this is before they do anything.
Right.
The lawyers let arrive. And for me, and for those of us in that part of it, in development office at the Opera House, this was, you know, hang on, we're building something wonderful, we're building something terrific here. No, it's building a building in the way they always do.
Right. I want to go back just a little bit. You had mentioned something about training in the earlier conversation. And I want to do a little fast forward for a minute, because one of the things that I found in my association with the ABTT is that they are very keen on and do what appears to be an excellent job of providing training opportunities. And, you know, that's always fascinated me. And I just, you know, wanted to get a clearer, better insight into how that works.
The training of the ABTT, it's based on empowering people to be able to do their jobs and to do their jobs safely and economically, so that they comply with the bits that the producer needs, which is to get the show onto the stage, but also to make sure that they're complying with laws, regulations, requirements, and all those other things which are there. So that's what we are geared to do, to make people better at their job and to make sure that they remain employed and all those other bits. But just basically to make British theatre better.
Right. And the ABTT, I should add, is the Association of British Theatre Technicians.
That's absolutely right. It is.
Got it right.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Their training program has levels to it. I've seen advertisements for the bronze level and the silver
And the gold.
And the gold.
And in fact, we're also talking about a platinum level, but that's degree or master's sort of area. We're still talking about that. Basically, the bronze level is somebody who can be left alone to do a certain job. Again, a bit like I talked about at the Royal Opera House, where you start off with someone who knows one job particularly well, but like in all aspects of theatre, you're the jack of all trades and a master of one, although it's often the other way around, as described. You know a little bit about a lot.
Right.
So what we're trying to do is to basically give people a transportable qualification. The reason behind this is that when I was in the West End, you'd have someone who'd apply for a job as a stage daemon, or someone on the stage crew, or becoming an electrician. And the only way that you really knew they were any good at what they did was to ring up their previous employer. Mm-hmm. And they would come equipped with references and all the rest of it, but references, interesting documents, but best left to a telephone conversation to work out what it was.
Right.
And so we've always tried to make sure that it becomes a transportable qualification to take with you, to say that that's the case.
Excellent.
And it's a bit of a pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, because we have people who have been working in theatre for longer than me, who have no qualifications whatsoever, but don't want to sit any exams because they know what they're doing. They are obviously afraid of failing, and that's shown to be not right. So we have a bit of a grandfather arrangement. So it is slowly, by the generation, working its way through, so that you end up with formal qualifications to work in theatres.
Right. Your involvement with 7909, did that come through the ABTT, or is that through a different channel?
BS 7909, which is temporary power systems for essentially entertainment. So it's primarily for outside work. The British Standards Institute works on having representatives from bodies, so they have very few individuals who go with it. So yes, I was an ABTT representative on BS 7909. I had a slight advantage in that one of the things at the Royal Opera House was that I went and got some formal qualifications in electrics. Mm-hmm. Electrical theory, electrical design, and all that sort of part. So I could actually sit with a bit of engineering knowledge as well as the practical knowledge on how to go about setting up temporary electrical systems. Right. And that was a fascinating bit.
Right.
with 7909, it's to do with getting big power into small power and getting it around the place. But the sort of stuff that we connect up to those electricity suppliers is very different from what it was in the good old days. So the good old days, the equivalent of piano boards and all the rest of it, whereby you had simple dimmers and stuff, or simple chasing incandescent light bulbs on the end of it. That's all gone.
Right.
And now we have the problem with harmonics, and that is that you're chopping up the electrical current, meaning that it introduces a whole set of rules, a whole set of behaviour to do with heating up of equipment, things going off when you really don't expect them to go off. So what we try and do is to explain from first principles why that happens and how you go about with a simple set of rules of avoiding that, what we call nuisance tripping, but the electrical engineers call it unwanted tripping, because they say that if it's gone off, there's a problem.
Right. Right. Well, I think this is probably a great segue into LED lighting and LED power and all that's going on with that these days.
And it's exactly the problem, and that is that you are connecting up a device, which is, it pumps a whole lot of bad stuff back down the mains. Right. Although it uses less electricity in total, it also starts to put some stuff down the line which starts to affect other equipment in the building, let alone the RCD or the ground fault circuit interrupter, because they are now very sensitive. The good old-fashioned safety switch is now really sensitive and gets worried by these LED harmonics and currents and things that go around. And we explain this because we get a lot of DJs who've bought a whole load of LED equipment, and they go to the pub and they plug it into the mains in the pub, and suddenly their whole rig goes off.
Right, right.
So we attempt to explain, we do explain why it happens and what you've got to do to overcome that.
Sure.
And same thing happens with mains wiring into orchestra pits, where you get real problems around the world with hum loops, earth loops and other such things. And a real simple way of fixing that is to lift the earth wire on the electrical plug. This is
and by lift you mean remove?
Disconnect it.
Yes.
Now it's there for a really good reason.
Exactly.
And so we've had instances of musicians receiving really bad electric shocks. We've all seen the thing about people with microphones and all that, because suddenly their microphone is 110, 180, 200 volts above the thing that they're touching.
Right.
And so we see this
and we've seen some of the tragedies that have come about.
And that's the sort of thing we also say, and that is that, yeah, sure, you'll fix your audio problem, but the person in the box is probably not going to thank you.
Right.
Or their families.
Replacing it with a totally different and just as dangerous problem.
Absolutely. Yeah, more so.
Further on from that, I noticed in something I was reading about you that you're involved in measuring power outputs, or power usage, I should say, on the West End.
That's right. And basically when we were doing the Royal Opera House, and I'm faced with the prospect of having to design the entire lighting system, which I do with help, there was always the question about how much mains power was actually required. And I'd seen huge mains supplies into theatres, and I wondered why you needed that amount of power, because there didn't seem to be that many lights on, even when it was really bright. So I wondered how that had come about, and more importantly, what it was that you actually needed, how much power you really needed in a theatre.
Right.
And so I held this poll amongst the lighting department of the Royal Opera House about a particular production, which was Sleeping Beauty, Maria Bjornsson's thing. There was a 60 by 60 foot cyc, which was lit in really deep blue, which required a lot of electrical power. Electrical engineers get worried, not with turn-on current, which people still do, worrying about things, but turn-on current is a problem because it's you tend to put in bigger supplies in order to overcome this problem, and that's not the way around it at all to fix the problem. So it is basically you worry about electricity that's going down a cable for more than 20 minutes, because at that point in time it starts to heat the cable up and the switch gear and all that bit.
Right.
Yeah. So, I asked the question of our lighting staff, how much power is going to be required for Act 2 of Sleeping Beauty, and the answer came back somewhere between 180 and 650 kilowatts or whatever. And the prize for the person who actually got it right was 3 pints of beer of their choosing. So anyway, I bought this measuring equipment, and we actually started to measure the real amount of power around the West End. And we discovered that the theatres are well and truly oversupplied with electricity, with the exception of a few. And why that's important is that you pay for the potential amount of power that you're getting in. So if you've got a megawatt, a million watts of electricity available, you're paying something like £120,000 in UK terms, so what's that, $150,000 or about, just to have the electricity in the building before you actually start to use any of it.
Right.
And it goes down in terms of so you need to get this particular bit right for the economic well-being of the sustainability of it. So we measured this stuff and found out that yes, we were probably oversupplying theatres by a factor of at least 2.
Right.
And it was fascinating also in terms of everybody assumed that those big bright lights were the big main user of electricity in the building in terms of a theatre, how much it actually used. The answer was that if you took the whole building over a week, the electricity for the lighting, even in tungsten days, was about 16 to 20% of the total amount of energy in the building.
Right.
Because of all of the heating, the air conditioning, the air handling, all that sort of offices and stuff.
So it was the environmental controls that were pulling up more power.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that was the bit. And then the other part was that to look at, because in most theatre shows you get stuff which is often very dark, but in terms of stage spoken word stuff, or you get musicals, which are the worst because you've got all upstates apart from curtain calls, but usually the end of Act 1 ends up in a really bright state.
Right.
Was to find out just how much of that was being, how much of it was doing. And we discovered that it wasn't very much at all.
Right.
But what it did have was a bit of a base load on it. So it was the electricity that you were using even though it was dark on stage. So we'd observed all this because you're keeping the lights alight and keeping the lamps, filaments alight. So we were looking at these huge peaks and troughs as going, So then that was fine for tungsten lighting, but now the LED stuff is really taking off. And particularly in the West End, I see less of it here on Broadway, interestingly. Is that we introduced video screens. Video screens are incredibly disruptive to the electricity supply in all sorts of ways. And the difference between the amount of electricity when you've got a black screens and the amount of electricity it uses when everything's at full brightness is very little.
Really?
Yeah. So you can have anything up to 100 kilowatts of screen, but you've got 90 kilowatts of what I call blackout power.
Right.
Because it's just shuttering off all the electronics, everything else behind it is just being cut off, like a shutter on a moving light.
Right.
You've still got all of that discharge power going on behind it.
Right.
So what it's meant is that this low energy revolution that's come about is that whilst we were using, a typical show was using about the same amount of electricity that an average house used every quarter in electricity terms. What's happened is that but that also had huge peaks and troughs in it.
Right.
What's happening now is that you're still using about the same amount of power, but there's the peaks have all gone. And so, but you still end up with this great big lump that you're paying for even though there's no light on the stage.
Right. Did you do any work on the regional side of the industry? I mean, I know you've done a lot of work on the West End, but were you out there in
yeah,
the
we
regional?
took shows on tour.
Uh-huh.
And various versions with Howard Eaton, various versions of Cats and Phantom and shows like that,
Right.
and other stuff as well that we were building bespoke equipment for.
Right.
And that was, but that it was touring shows as opposed to actually having worked in one of these places,
Mm-hmm. Okay.
which is,
Yeah, a little different.
yeah.
Was there ever a project out there that you turned down that you look back now and go,
That's a really good question. I think I'd applied for certain sort of jobs, or rather been suggested that I apply for certain technical directorships.
mm-hmm.
And there are a bit of times when you're a little bit disappointed because you weren't either selected or even talked to in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to say I've been extremely lucky because most of those jobs have been on the revolving door principle of, where there's a vacancy, there's a problem in
Right,
those sort
exactly.
of things. Yeah. So I've never really been headhunted as such.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I noticed you didn't have a revolving door policy when you took on the chairmanship at the ABTT.
Yeah, I did it for 12 years. At that point in time, it was over 40 years old and had reached that state in a lot of organizations where it was really at a crossroads in terms of where it needed to be. Mm-hmm. And it was just sort of continuing on more or less with what it did, but was losing money. There was no income being earned at all for it, and it was going through its deficit. And when I ended up there to come in, it had something like 18 to 24 months left of life before it actually had no money and shut the doors.
Right.
So we decided that I should provide a bit of leadership, which it didn't have before, and B, to set about raising some money,
Mm-hmm.
and which indeed we did, and we kept it going. One of the things that kept the ABTT going was the original version of TEAC, which is the Technical Theatre Engineering Architecture Conference, the original one, before it was ITEAC.
Right.
And that was done in 2001 by Dick Brett.
Right.
And we essentially helped Dick to make all that happen. In return for that, he gave us some money that had surplus.
Right.
Straight back to the ABTT, and thank you, Dick Brett, because you kept the ABTT afloat.
Right. And I was and that was something that I did want to talk with you about because, as you know, I stole that idea and brought it over to this side. But both TEAC and ITEAC, the International Theatre Engineering and Architecture Conference, have had a great influence, I think, on what's going on in the industry from an architecture and from building new theaters and refitting old ones. Would you agree with that? I mean, what kind of influence do you see? What kind of impact has those conferences had?
What it did was that it gave people from around the world. That the last one was 32 countries. Mm-hmm. People who came from there. So we had a lot of people from China, we had people from Australia, we had people from some from here, and who basically got together and spoke about really common problems, which is to do with structure and engineering, like it says on the tin. Right. So when we did the first one, 2001, there were no LEDs, for example.
Right.
For example, variable speed drives were still in their infancy. Mm-hmm. Still a bit noisy, still a bit all sorts of other things. And that's changed in the intervening time. And so those parts become really interesting bits of history to look back on.
Sure. And what effect do you think the things that we talk about at these conferences, do they do you see, I guess, do you see like an impact in shows showing up at the West End, for example? And I think what I mean by that is that automation has become clearly the name of the game. And the timing of it seems to coincide with some of the conferences, and you're getting a bunch of engineers, and they're all sitting around talking in the same room. They're going to come up with something.
You'd hope so. It's interesting because theatre has always borrowed from something else. Be it rigging on ships or whatever, if that's true or not, because there's a gent in Canada who says it had nothing to do, that they grew up each, using the same sort of stuff. But we've always borrowed stuff since Elizabethan times. We've always used someone else's technology because we're simply not big enough.
Right.
As an industry.
Right.
And that's exactly what happens with automation.
Sure. I guess this might be a personal preference question, but automation, is it intruding? Is it enhancing a performance, do you think, or is it an intrusion?
It's a really good question. The answer is I rather hope that it enhances the performance. The far more disruptive part in live theatre is video screens. So that's the bit. Automation actually helps and shouldn't distract in the same way that video often does.
Right.
But they're both relatively new technologies.
Right. Does this fall into the category of just because you can doesn't mean that you should?
Should. That's absolutely true when it comes to a lot of things.
Right. Right.
But in terms of, we always talk about at TIAC conferences, and we did it at NATIAC as well, about whether it does become intrusive and you use simply because it's there.
Right.
But in terms of things like performer flying, so you can move people around extremely quickly, and does it actually help the production? Cirque du Soleil, most certainly it does.
Of course,
spectacular. But of course, we always have spoken about forever about competing with, first of all, it was film, then it was television. Now it's film with things like CGI and all the rest of it. And we're trying to reproduce night after night a good, spectacular sort of a show. Right.
And we also have to compete with mobile phones,
Ah, yes. That's it's an issue which is all around the world.
Sure.
And if you speak to the people in China and they say, you think you've got a problem, wait till you come and see us.
Right.
And it is indeed the problem with people using it during a show because they're tweeting or doing whatever.
Right.
Instagram. And the real problem is not so much the cameras which have got little red lights on them, which are videoing stuff, but people using them during the performance and annoying the life out of the people who paid $140 or whatever it is for a seat, which they probably really didn't come along to watch you doing your stuff.
Probably not.
No.
Yes. So what I've seen in some of the theaters is that kind of, if you can't beat them, at least corral them.
In the Theatre Royal Stratford East, which was near the 2012 Olympics site, they made a real move towards getting young people to come to theatre, because as usual, as the population ages, it's not necessarily replacing the people who come to theatre and the rest of it, because they've got so many other things. Not an unusual, uncommon problem. However, what they did was that they put everybody up in the top circle.
Right.
If you're going to use your phone during performance, if you're addicted to this thing, we want you to go up there.
Right. Right. Did it work?
Yes and no, because it didn't stop them talking.
No. True.
Because that's what you do, and that's what you.
Yeah.
So yes, it's. But of recent times, it's also been. We've had a couple of shows in the West End where they banned people from eating because of the wrappers and all that sort of stuff, let alone the smell of the Big Macs or whatever that they're going to bring in with them, which really doesn't help other people's stuff.
No.
So that's we're starting to see a little control over.
Right.
And it's the usual problem: do you put people off?
Right.
Yeah.
It's the last thing we want to do at this stage of the
Absolutely.
game.
Yeah, because it's seen as enough as a white middle class sort of entertainment.
Right. So we've been talking about automation and the influences there, LEDs, cell phones, that sort of thing. I know personally, I never would have dreamed, 10, 15 years ago, looking this far forward, the things that we are doing, the things that we are able to do,
Sure.
Regardless of whether we should be doing them or not. What do you think the West End looks like, 10 or 15 years down the road?
It's a really good question, and it's the stuff that we do talk about at the TIAC conferences. Mm-hmm. And I think it also occurred at NATIAC, and we were talking about Broadway theatres. And the problem with all of them is that they're so hamstrung, they're so tight by their boundaries.
Right.
I have to say most Broadway theatres seem to occupy a lot less space footprint than do a lot of the West End stuff. And I notice things like you go sitting in a Broadway seat and nearby is the exit door, which handles straight onto the street.
Right.
Rare in a West End theatre that you've got that sort of distance to go. You've usually got to go through walkways and tunnels and the rest of it to get out. So that's, and do theatres need to change from their being a straight proscenium?
Right.
How do you adapt stuff? And do audiences require you to adapt things? Do you get people, and this is great conferences at things like the Theatres Trust in London, where they talk about the form of theatre and whether or not it should be adaptable and all the rest of it. And that's how the ABTT was set up in 1961. They ran a conference on adaptable theatres, because that was seen to be all the go, and there was experimental theatre that had just starting to happen. Right. Most of it came from France in the 50s, and basically I decided that we would hold a repeat conference of that exactly 50 years later in 2011. And we spoke about what it was like producing adaptable theatre in the 2000s, the 2010s. And turned out we spoke about exactly the same things that they'd done 50 years before.
Right.
And it's all very well to have an open black box into which you then move various bits of scenery, seating banks, all that sort of stuff. But you've got to have another box of exactly the same size to put it all in when you're not using it.
Right.
And that was the bits about, and then the questions then become, is every theatre a found space? Which is a nice way of looking at how you go about adapting a 120-year-old theatre into some sort of modern performance, as opposed to the serried ranks of people sitting there watching something on stage, opposed to around them. So we're also discovering now that there's, as happens here, there's a whole load of promenade theatre where people take a warehouse and they'll have it for a week and they'll put a performance on that involves moving from one place to another, generally in the dark. And so the ABTT says that's a fantastic thing to do, but there are certain safety things you've really got to do when you get that number of people involved anywhere. So
the immersive theatres.
Yeah, well, it turns out that there's a whole load of differences between these, subtle to someone who's not part of it. But when I started, we wrote this guideline about how to go about putting shows on in these found spaces, warehouses or whatever. And we first of all called it experiential theatre. So we gave the draft out to various people who do these shows saying, what do you think? And the part of the answer was, well, we do experimental theatre, or we do something else, experiential or whatever, immersive theatre. So it was a bit like the North Judean People's Liberation Front and all that bit. And so it was, we learned that there were sensitive titles that had to be used for these things. But the principles are all the same. You've got a group of people in a place when you're moving them around, often in the dark, and you've got to get them out.
Right.
And to do that, you've got to have the fire escapes all marked out as unobtrusively as possible, but also so you can see it. You've got to have emergency lighting. If you're going to use the elevators existing in the building, you've got to make sure that they're safe for them to use, that a floor is strong enough to get 50 or 60 people standing on.
Right.
And so that's the, and then you've also got to get the local council to not apply business rates to your thing, because that's for a lot of people, that just they can't cope financially with it.
It's a deal breaker, sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, you've had some issues. I mean, a lot of people, I think, don't realize when they go to a West End or a Broadway show that they are in a building that's 120 years old. And we're doing marvelous things. We're flinging chandeliers and people about, and they don't identify the difficulties with that. But on a similar vein, there are 120-year-old theaters.
Yeah.
And I know that you had, not you personally, but London and the West End had a problem with a piece of ceiling coming down.
That's right. We had about 10 square meters of plaster and the timber behind it come down at the Apollo Theatre on the 12th of December 2013, which was a date etched in all of our memory. And it severely injured about 10 people, and there are some other 65 people who were injured in some way as a result of this. And so the question became, the immediate question became, was that, is this going to happen in any other theatres? So as part of our ABTT work, we produce this bright yellow book called Technical Standards for Places of Entertainment. And in it, we give guidelines on what to do about various systems in the building, the electrical bits, the gas if you've got any, the water, the fire systems, escape stairs, all that stuff. And we had basically a catch-all phrase or two which said your ceiling should be inspected regularly and certified as being safe. Now the problem is with the things like electricity, gas and structures and things, there are formal qualifications and registrations. There are absolutely none in plaster.
Right.
So the question then becomes, of course, how do you know whether a ceiling is safe? So we assembled a group of 50 people. And we got a whole load of plastering contractors, we got theatre owners, we got the heritage buildings folk all together in the one room, acousticians and structural engineers, and basically said, we've obviously all got a problem here. How do we go about fixing it? So the plastering guys explained how they go about looking at theatres, how they go about looking at these suspended plaster ceilings.
Right.
And basically, you've got to look at it from the top all over the back of it, because what happened, the way they built these things, particularly the Edwardian theatres, in other words, the one from about 1890 to about 1920, they had these large plaster domes which were pretty much only held up by these bits of wadding, so-called, which is the equivalent of the sort of plaster around your arm. So they got hessian sacking in the middle of it, and then you coat the outside of it with plaster, and then you tie that to on the back of the plaster ceiling, and you tie it off to a beam in the roof. Problem is that hessian, which is actually providing the strength, rots after about 70 years. And if you don't replace it by steel wire or whatever else that you're going to use, it'll break. And the issue with the Apollo Theatre was that most theatres had been inspected from above. That bit of the Apollo had not.
Right.
And in World War II, they'd put in a flooring over the top of the ceiling, and no one had ever lifted that floor to look at the bit that fell in.
Right.
So what we did was that we developed a set of guidelines which said that you've got to be able to look at a ceiling from top and bottom. You've got to clean them up, because most people don't go into them and they're full of dust and or old bits of wire rope and multi-core cables and things sitting on the plaster. And so that meant that you've got to do your good housekeeping and get up there and keep it clean so you can see the back of it at least and see if there's anything going on.
Sure.
The bottom bit here's the big question, is do you need to get up to it every 7 years, whatever it is? Because those decorative parts, the cherubs and the gargoyles and all those other things which go to make up the beautiful looking theatres, they're actually made of plaster, and some of them are huge. They've held up initially by putting a whole load of wet plaster on the back of it, applying that to the ceiling, letting that dry so that you end up with this thing being held up because all the air's come out of it. How do you know after 70 years or whatever it is that this particular piece of decoration is going to stay there?
Yeah. And
we have stories from the plasterers who come along and they wriggle these large bits of stuff and suddenly it starts to come off in their hand. And so they're left holding this piece which they don't want to let drop because it'll smash. And they're sort of hanging onto this thing, so help, come and get it. So what they've got to do is to then put rods through those things to the back and all the rest of it to make it as it should. Sure. So that was a fascinating exercise in trying to get the theatre industry's house in order. Right. And the health and safety executive loved this because it was something that the government didn't do. It was industry-derived guidance.
Right. Right.
So that was, But if it happens again, we're all in trouble.
Yeah. Health and safety executive is the HSE, right?
The HSE is a government organisation,
right.
And the difference between what happens here in the United States and what happens is that it's criminal law over there. So it is a government body, the equivalent of the IRS,
right.
that investigates you and sends you to jail if they convince the court that you've done something wrong.
Right.
And now we've got the Corporate Manslaughter Act, which also means that the directors of the company go to jail, whether they were involved in the thing because they did not take all reasonable precautions to prevent the occurrence of the incident.
Right. I know I have my moments that I look back on, moments that affected me greatly, a theatrical moment that just did it for me, told me why I was in the business or why I should stay in the business. And I'm wondering if you've got any of those kind of moments, either backstage or sitting in an audience.
I think for me it was my first show in the West End, which was Cats. And it was a really pleasant place to be in because it was absolutely sold out every night. And the Cameron McIntosh organisation was finally starting to make some money, a lot of it. And so it was a really good place to be, provided that you worked hard and made that show the same every night.
Right.
And to the point where I still hear the music to the ball at the end of Act 1, and I still love it.
Ah, that's great.
Yeah. Phantom was the original production of Phantom. There are certain things you remember, such as the magician Paul Daniels, who was actually in charge of doing things like the disappearing chair and fake candles and exploding candles and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
Watching him convince the fire officer that there was going to be, you could do all this stuff because you had the flashes and bangs and other things around the place, especially, and he had this sheet of flash paper, and the fire officer is there with his cap, down here, sort of, convince me. And here's this almost world-famous magician, been on the TV for years, the rest of it, and he's a little guy. And he sort of convinced me. So the forest was saying, well, I don't like those, these explosions going off all over the place. It'll set fire to the place, and we'll have 34 members of the audience dead within seconds. And Daniel said, I'm going to show you how this works. And so he's got a clipboard, and he gets this sheet of flash paper, and he scrambles it up, sticks it on this guy's clipboard, and said, now, I'm going to make this disappear before you in a flash. And if so, and nothing happens to you, then you're going to let the show open, aren't you? And this guy says, well, it's not exactly the laboratory conditions, but I'll see what I can do. So produces a cigarette lighter, whoomph, this thing goes up, and there's a couple of little bits of ash on this guy's clipboard while it's about this far away from him. We can open the show now, says Daniels. This guy said, maybe. Could I get 4 tickets? Those are the sort of memorable moments.
Right. And on that note, I think that we should end this. I want to thank you. And
thank
cheers.
you, Bill.